Ethan Harper often told himself that luck had finally chosen his side. At 36, he had built a successful home renovation company through years of relentless work, married the woman he loved, and inherited the quiet countryside house where he had spent much of his childhood. Nestled among rolling fields and towering oak trees, the property offered peace that city life never could. It seemed like the perfect place for new beginnings after months filled with sorrow. Only 6 months earlier, Ethan had buried his mother. Her death had left an emptiness that echoed through every room of the old farmhouse, especially for his father, Richard. Once cheerful and independent, Richard now wandered through his days carrying a sadness that appeared too heavy for one man to bear. Ethan couldn't ignore the loneliness in his father's eyes, so inviting him to spend more time at their home felt like the natural thing to do. Claire agreed without hesitation. If it'll help him heal, she gently told Ethan one evening, then we should be there for him. Family doesn't disappear when things become difficult. Her kindness only strengthened Ethan's belief that he had chosen the right woman. Claire possessed a calm warmth that seemed capable of softening anyone's grief. Richard often smiled around her in ways Ethan hadn't seen since before his mother's illness. Watching them laugh together during dinners gave Ethan comfort instead of concern. The days settled into a predictable rhythm. Each morning Ethan left before sunrise to supervise construction projects across the county. Claire worked remotely from home, leaving her with flexible hours. Richard usually visited during the afternoons, helping with small repairs around the property or simply sharing coffee with Claire on the wide wooden porch overlooking endless green fields. Nothing about it appeared unusual. Still, the quiet countryside carried strange moods. Thick morning fog wrapped itself around the farmhouse like a curtain, while evenings settled beneath crimson sunsets that painted long shadows across the land. The isolation made every sound feel louder. The distant bark of a dog, the creaking porch swing, footsteps crossing the gravel driveway. Sometimes Ethan returned home to find Claire and Richard talking in low voices inside the kitchen. Their conversations always stopped the moment he entered. "There you are," Claire would say with a welcoming smile. "Dinner's almost ready." Richard usually cleared his throat before changing the subject. Ethan dismissed the awkward pauses as simple embarrassment. His father rarely spoke openly about grief, and perhaps those private conversations were easier without an audience. Weeks passed. Claire began stopping by Richard's house more frequently, delivering groceries or helping organize paperwork left untouched after Ethan's mother's passing. Whenever Ethan thanked her, she brushed the praise aside. He shouldn't have to face everything alone. Richard echoed the sentiment. "She's been a blessing," he admitted quietly one afternoon while repairing an old fence. "Your mother would have appreciated everything Claire's doing." Ethan smiled, grateful that healing finally seemed possible. Yet tiny moments refused to settle comfortably in his mind. One evening he noticed Richard resting his hand on Claire's shoulder a second longer than necessary while thanking her for dinner. Another afternoon Claire quickly slipped her phone into her pocket when Ethan unexpectedly walked into the living room. Neither incident seemed important enough to question, but together they created an uncomfortable feeling Ethan couldn't explain. He blamed exhaustion. Business had expanded rapidly, forcing him into 12-hour workdays. Fatigue made people imagine things, he reasoned. Then came the rainy Thursday. A canceled client meeting allowed Ethan to drive home hours earlier than expected. Heavy clouds darkened the countryside as his truck rolled slowly along the muddy driveway. Before shutting off the engine, movement near the backyard caught his attention. Richard hurried across the wet grass toward the rear gate, pulling his jacket tightly around himself despite the mild weather. He glanced over his shoulder once before disappearing through the back entrance of the property instead of using the front path. Confused, Ethan stepped from his truck. The front door opened almost immediately. Claire stood there breathing slightly harder than usual, forcing a pleasant smile. "I thought you'd be home much later." For the first time since his mother's funeral, something inside Ethan quietly whispered that perhaps not everything was exactly as it seemed. The uneasy feeling that settled inside Ethan after seeing Richard leave through the back gate refused to disappear. Claire insisted his father had simply stopped by to drop off homemade preserves, and Richard casually repeated the same explanation the following afternoon. Their matching stories sounded convincing, yet something about the rehearsed certainty behind their words left Ethan strangely unsettled. He tried convincing himself that grief had made everyone awkward. Losing a wife, losing a mother, and rebuilding ordinary routines could easily create uncomfortable moments. Still, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse gradually shifted in ways too subtle to confront but too persistent to ignore. Richard visited more often than before. Sometimes Ethan returned from work to find empty coffee mugs on the porch and quiet laughter fading as his truck entered the driveway. Claire always greeted him warmly, but Richard suddenly became eager to leave, inventing excuses about unfinished chores or appointments that had never been mentioned earlier. "You two looked busy," Ethan remarked one evening. "We were sorting old family photographs," Claire answered with a smile. Richard nodded quickly. "Mostly your mother's albums." The explanation sounded harmless, yet neither of them offered to show Ethan the photographs they had supposedly spent hours organizing. Days later, Ethan noticed an elegant silver bracelet resting on Claire's bedside table. "I don't remember buying that," he said. Claire hesitated before replying. "Your father gave it to me." Richard laughed when Ethan asked about it during dinner. "She's done so much helping an old widower. Consider it a thank you gift." Claire lowered her eyes and quietly added, "I told him it was too expensive." "It's nothing compared to your kindness," Richard insisted. Ethan smiled politely, though the exchange lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have. Within another week, a designer handbag appeared beside Claire's closet. Richard claimed he had found it on sale while visiting town. Claire protested in front of Ethan, but only briefly, eventually accepting the gift after Richard refused to take it back. The pattern repeated itself often enough to become impossible to ignore. Behind Claire's grateful smiles lived a growing storm of shame. She remembered the afternoon everything had begun months earlier, shortly after Margaret Harper's funeral. Richard had broken down while sorting through his late wife's belongings. Claire had comforted him with nothing more than compassion, believing he simply needed someone willing to listen. "You remind me of her," Richard had whispered through tears. Those words became regular conversations. He called during Ethan's long workdays, asking for help with paperwork, meals, or memories he claimed were too painful to face alone. Claire never intended to replace anyone. She simply answered every request because she believed kindness could heal grief. Gradually, the conversations became more personal. Richard spoke about loneliness, regret, aging, and fears of dying alone. He praised Claire constantly, telling her she understood him better than anyone else ever had. His compliments filled emotional spaces she had never realized existed. Ethan loved her deeply, but endless business hours often left her isolated inside the quiet farmhouse. One rainy afternoon, Richard embraced her while thanking her for saving him from despair. Claire should have stepped away. Instead, she remained still. That single moment blurred every boundary they both knew should never be crossed. The emotional attachment became secret meetings, stolen conversations, and eventually a relationship neither dared define aloud. Every encounter deepened Claire's guilt, yet leaving seemed harder each time Richard pleaded that she was the only reason he still wanted to live. She hated herself for believing him. Weeks passed beneath an invisible weight. One evening, Ethan borrowed Claire's phone after misplacing his own. As he searched for a contractor's number, a notification briefly flashed before disappearing. Curious, he opened the messaging application. An entire conversation thread had been deleted. Only an empty space remained where hundreds of messages should have been. Ethan searched the recently deleted folder, hoping the conversation could be restored. It was completely empty. Standing alone in the silent kitchen, he stared at the blank screen, realizing someone had made certain those messages would never be easily recovered. Ethan barely slept after discovering the erased messages on Claire's phone. The empty conversation haunted him more than any words he might have read. Someone had deliberately removed every trace, and the thought settled heavily in his mind. By morning, he convinced himself that jumping to conclusions would only destroy his marriage. If there was an explanation, he wanted facts before accusations. Without mentioning his concerns to anyone, Ethan purchased several wireless security cameras while returning from a construction site. He told Claire they were simply precautionary measures because expensive equipment had recently gone missing from nearby farms. "You can never be too careful," he said casually while mounting the first camera above the garage. Claire forced a smile. "That's probably smart." Although she appeared supportive, Ethan noticed her watching every camera he installed with unusual attention. Her eyes lingered on each lens as though silently calculating what it could see. She never questioned their placement, yet her cheerful confidence slowly faded during the following days. Richard arrived that afternoon carrying fresh vegetables from his garden. "You've turned this place into a fortress," he joked, glancing toward the newly installed cameras. Ethan shrugged, "Just protecting what's important." For a brief second, Richard's smile disappeared before returning just as quickly. Claire noticed it too. Later that evening, after Ethan left to inspect another project, Richard remained behind longer than usual. They stood quietly inside the kitchen while rain tapped softly against the windows. "We have to stop this," Claire whispered, refusing to meet his eyes. Richard stepped closer. "You've said that before. I mean it now. You don't." His voice remained calm, almost comforting. "You still answer my calls. You still let me come here." Claire wrapped her arms tightly around herself. "I'm terrified." Richard gently touched her hand. "If you leave me now, I'll lose everything. After Margaret died, you became the only person keeping me alive." His words carried the same emotional weight that had trapped her months earlier. Every attempt to walk away dissolved beneath overwhelming guilt. She knew the relationship had become destructive, yet each goodbye somehow turned into another secret meeting. The cameras silently watched from outside. Days passed beneath growing tension. Claire became distracted, often staring through windows toward the driveway whenever unfamiliar vehicles approached. She startled whenever Ethan mentioned work schedules or unexpected changes in his routine. Ethan noticed everything. Still, he found no evidence that justified confronting either of them. Then another piece unexpectedly arrived. While purchasing lumber from the local hardware store, Ethan ran into their elderly neighbor, Harold Benson. The cheerful retiree casually mentioned seeing Richard almost every weekday. "Your dad sure enjoys visiting," Harold laughed. Ethan looked confused. "What do you mean? I pass your place nearly every afternoon walking my dog." His pickups usually parked outside for hours. Ethan forced a polite smile. "He's been helping Claire around the house." "Well," Harold replied, "she's lucky to have family nearby." The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it echoed inside Ethan's head during the entire drive home. Every afternoon. For hours. Far more often than Richard had ever admitted. That evening, Ethan quietly reviewed the security recordings. Most clips showed ordinary routines, delivery drivers, wildlife crossing the yard, and Richard arriving for brief visits. Nothing appeared suspicious enough to explain the growing knot in Ethan's stomach. Until 3 days later. One camera overlooking the side garden activated shortly after noon. Richard stepped onto the patio carrying flowers. Claire opened the back door. They spoke for several moments, though the camera captured no sound. Then Richard reached forward. Claire hesitated only briefly before allowing him to wrap his arms around her. The embrace lasted several long seconds. Neither appeared surprised. Neither tried pulling away. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the screen, desperately searching for an innocent explanation that refused to appear. Suddenly, the recording flickered. Static filled the image. The screen turned completely black. When the picture finally returned several seconds later, both Claire and Richard had disappeared from view. Ethan replayed the damaged footage repeatedly, hoping the missing seconds would somehow reveal the truth instead of hiding it. Instead, they only deepened the terrible question he could no longer force himself to ignore. The black screen haunted Ethan long after he shut off the monitor. He replayed the corrupted recording until sunrise, hoping the missing seconds would somehow restore themselves. Instead, the damaged footage only deepened the nightmare growing inside his mind. The embrace he had witnessed refused to leave him, yet a desperate part of him still searched for another explanation. The following morning, Ethan removed the memory card from the camera and drove to a digital recovery specialist in the nearest town. He explained that the footage had become corrupted during a power interruption. The technician accepted the card without asking many questions. It may take a day, the technician said. Sometimes damaged files hide more than people expect. Those words echoed inside Ethan's thoughts throughout the endless hours that followed. When the call finally came the next afternoon, Ethan returned immediately. We recovered most of it, the technician explained, handing him a flash drive. There are still a few missing frames, but almost everything else survived. Ethan thanked him quietly and left before opening the file. He parked beside an abandoned picnic area overlooking a quiet lake. His hands trembled as he inserted the flash drive into his laptop. The recording began several minutes before the damaged section. Richard arrived carrying flowers. Claire welcomed him inside with a smile Ethan had not seen in months. They spoke on the patio before Richard gently touched her face. Claire looked away for only a moment, then leaned toward him. Their embrace became a kiss that lingered with unmistakable intimacy. Minutes later, they disappeared through the back door together. The recovered footage continued inside the living room camera. There was no misunderstanding, no innocent explanation, no comforting illusion. Richard kissed his son's wife again. Claire never resisted. Ethan closed the laptop so quickly it nearly slipped from his hands. His breathing became uneven as waves of disbelief crashed against every memory he possessed. The woman he loved and the father he respected had destroyed the foundation of his life without a single word. He remained beside the lake until darkness swallowed the horizon. When he finally returned home, he behaved exactly as he always had. Claire smiled. Long day? Very. He kissed her forehead despite everything he had seen. She smiled back. That hurt even more. Days passed beneath unbearable silence. Ethan spoke little, claiming work pressures had exhausted him. Claire accepted the explanation, though she sensed something had shifted behind his quiet eyes. He no longer laughed during dinner. He rarely touched her hand. At night, he stared toward the ceiling until sunrise while pretending to sleep whenever she rolled closer. Inside his mind, every family memory became poisoned. He remembered Richard teaching him to ride a bicycle. He remembered introducing Claire to his parents. He remembered his wedding day, watching his father proudly stand beside him while promising that family would always protect one another. Every memory now carried another meaning. Had they been lying for months? Had they secretly laughed behind his back? Had everyone noticed except him? Humiliation slowly transformed into anger. Not loud anger, quiet anger, the kind that settled deep inside the soul and waited patiently. Meanwhile, Claire reached her breaking point. She arranged to meet Richard at a small church parking lot several miles outside town, believing no one would recognize them. "This has to end," she whispered as soon as he stepped from his truck. Richard frowned. "We've discussed this." "No, you've talked. I've listened." Tears filled her eyes. "I can't keep betraying Ethan." Richard moved closer. "You still love me?" Claire shook her head. "I don't even know what this is anymore. You'll regret leaving." "I already regret staying." For the first time since their relationship began, Claire walked away before Richard could stop her. She cried throughout the drive home, realizing that ending the affair would never erase the damage already done. Richard watched her disappear down the road. His expression slowly hardened. That evening, Ethan received a message that a longtime client wished to postpone another construction project. With unexpected free hours ahead, he wandered through town searching for anything capable of quieting the chaos consuming his thoughts. Eventually, his truck stopped outside a sporting goods store. He stood motionless for several minutes before stepping inside. The salesman greeted him politely. "Looking for anything specific?" Ethan hesitated. "A handgun." The paperwork took less than an hour. When he walked back into the afternoon sunlight carrying the locked case, his face revealed nothing about the storm raging beneath the surface. Whether the weapon represented protection, desperation, or something far darker, even Ethan himself no longer knew. The locked handgun remained hidden inside Ethan's workshop, untouched but impossible to forget. Every morning he walked past the metal cabinet where it rested, reminding himself that buying it had not answered a single question. The truth still lay somewhere between two people whose stories had yet to be heard. Before making any irreversible decision, he needed to confront them separately. He chose Richard first. Driving to his father's modest farmhouse felt strangely unfamiliar, as though every mile carried him farther from the childhood he once treasured. Richard welcomed him with his usual smile, but the warmth faded the moment Ethan's expression revealed that this was not an ordinary visit. "We need to talk," Ethan said quietly. Richard gestured toward the living room. "Sit down." For several silent seconds, Ethan simply stared at the man who had raised him. "I know about you and Claire." Richard's face drained of color before settling into forced composure. "You don't understand." "Then explain." Richard lowered his eyes and sighed heavily. "I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Ethan's voice trembled. "She's my wife." Richard rubbed his forehead as though exhausted by the conversation. "Claire came to me after your mother died. She comforted me, listened to me, spent hours here while you buried yourself in work. Somewhere along the way, she crossed the line." Ethan stared in disbelief. "She pursued you?" Richard nodded slowly. "I resisted for a long time. I was broken, lonely, grieving. She kept telling me I deserved happiness again. Eventually, I gave in." The explanation sounded rehearsed. Every sentence shifted responsibility away from Richard while painting him as a helpless victim of circumstance. "You expect me to believe that?" Ethan asked. "I'm ashamed of what happened," Richard replied softly, "but I never planned any of this." Ethan left without another word. The drive home felt even longer. Claire stood in the kitchen preparing dinner when he entered. One look at his face told her everything. "You talked to him?" "I did." She placed the knife on the counter with trembling hands. "And? He says you started it." Claire closed her eyes. "Of course he does." Ethan folded his arms. "So tell me your version." Silence filled the room before Claire finally spoke. "After your mother died, your father called constantly. At first it was paperwork, groceries, memories. Then he started saying I was the only person who understood him." She struggled to maintain steady breathing. "You were always working. I felt alone too. I was working for us." "I know." Tears rolled down her face. "But loneliness doesn't always wait for good intentions." Claire admitted that Richard slowly blurred emotional boundaries through guilt, compliments, and dependence. Whenever she tried creating distance, he reminded her that she had become the only reason he wanted to keep living. "He made me feel responsible for him," she whispered, Then why didn't you tell me? I was ashamed. Her answer barely rose above a whisper. I hated what I was becoming. Ethan looked into her tear-filled eyes, searching desperately for certainty. Instead, he found confusion. Richard claimed Claire had manipulated him. Claire claimed Richard had manipulated her. Both admitted the affair. Both accepted partial blame. Both insisted the other had crossed the first line. Every answer created another impossible question. Sleep abandoned Ethan entirely. He wandered through empty rooms. Ethan hesitated. Claire stood nearby, watching him with anxious eyes. After several seconds, he finally replied, "We'll be there." Neither of them believed peace was truly possible, but avoiding the meeting no longer seemed like an option. The following evening, gray clouds stretched across the countryside as Ethan and Claire drove toward Richard's farmhouse. The familiar road felt strangely unfamiliar now, every passing tree carrying memories that no longer offered comfort. Claire remained silent throughout the journey, twisting her wedding ring around her finger until the skin beneath it turned red. Richard welcomed them with forced politeness. Dinner's ready. The dining room looked exactly as Ethan remembered from childhood. Family photographs still covered the walls, including portraits of happier years when his mother had filled the house with laughter. Seeing her smiling face while standing between the two people who had betrayed her memory made Ethan's chest tighten painfully. No one touched the food. Knives and forks rested untouched while uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "We're here because secrets have destroyed enough already." Claire lowered her eyes. Ethan remained motionless. Richard folded his hands together. "I've spent months blaming everyone except myself." His voice sounded older than Ethan had ever heard before. "Your mother wasn't the first person I manipulated." Ethan slowly looked up. "What are you talking about?" Richard released a long, exhausted breath. "I controlled this family for years." He admitted encouraging Ethan's dependence throughout childhood, convincing him that obedience meant love. Every major decision, from college choices to career opportunities, had quietly passed through Richard's approval. Whenever Ethan questioned him, Richard responded with guilt instead of honesty. "I always needed to matter," Richard confessed. "I thought fathers were supposed to guide their children. They are. I crossed that line." Claire listened without speaking. Richard continued. "When Margaret became ill, I controlled her too. I convinced myself I was protecting her, but really I was terrified of losing influence over the people I loved." Ethan's hands slowly tightened into fists. "So everything was manipulation?" "Not everything, but enough." Richard looked toward Claire. "After your mother died, I couldn't bear being alone." Claire closed her eyes. "I know. You were kind to me. I was trying to help. I turned your kindness into something selfish." The room fell silent again. For one brief moment, Ethan almost believed genuine remorse had finally appeared. Then Richard quietly added, "But you stayed because you wanted to." Claire immediately looked up. "No, you had choices. You made me believe leaving would destroy you." Richard shook his head. "You needed someone because Ethan was never home." Claire's chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor as she stood. "Stop twisting everything. I'm telling the truth." "No," Claire shouted. "You're protecting yourself." Ethan remained frozen between them. Every sentence sounded believable. Every accusation carried pieces of truth. Claire faced Ethan with tears streaming down her face. "I had an affair with your father." The words echoed through the room like breaking glass. "I betrayed you." Her voice collapsed into sobs. "I should have told you months ago." Richard stood abruptly. "You make it sound like I forced everything. You manipulated me. You loved me. I hated myself every single day." The argument exploded. Years of hidden resentment surfaced all at once. Ethan accused Richard of poisoning every childhood memory he possessed. Richard accused Ethan of abandoning both his family and his marriage for work. Claire blamed herself for every lie that followed. Voices grew louder. Chairs overturned. A framed family photograph crashed against the floor, scattering broken glass across the dining room. Richard suddenly stepped toward Claire. "You don't get to ruin my life." She backed away. "You already ruined it yourself." Ethan moved between them. Enough. No one listened. Richard shoved Ethan aside. Claire screamed. The room dissolved into panic. Someone stumbled against a cabinet near the hallway. A locked drawer slid open from the impact. Inside rested a handgun. 3 terrified faces turned toward it at exactly the same moment. Then one trembling hand reached forward before anyone else could react. Everything that followed would soon have to be reconstructed by investigators, because in that single heartbeat, the Harper family's final chance to escape tragedy vanished forever. The deafening crack of gunfire shattered the quiet countryside, sending frightened birds into the darkening sky. Within minutes, neighbors rushed onto their porches, unsure whether they had heard fireworks or something far more terrifying. A second shot echoed across the fields, followed by a third. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. One trembling resident dialed emergency services. By the time sheriff's deputies reached Richard Harper's farmhouse, flashing blue and red lights reflected across rain-soaked windows. The front door stood slightly open. No voices answered repeated commands from outside. The deputies entered cautiously. Broken dishes littered the dining room floor beside overturned chairs. Fragments of shattered glass sparkled beneath flashlight beams. A trail of blood stretched toward the hallway. Richard Harper lay motionless beside the living room entrance. 3 gunshot wounds marked his chest. The handgun rested several feet away. Paramedics checked for signs of life despite the obvious outcome. Nothing. Richard was pronounced dead at the scene. Deputies immediately searched every room inside the farmhouse. No one else remained. Ethan Harper and Claire Harper had vanished. The disappearance transformed an apparent domestic tragedy into an urgent homicide investigation. Detective Rachel Bennett arrived shortly after midnight. Years of violent crime investigations had taught her that first impressions often concealed uncomfortable truths. She stood silently inside the dining room, studying every damaged object before speaking to anyone. "What do we know?" she asked. A deputy consulted his notebook. Neighbors reported 3 gunshots around 8:37. Richard's deceased. Ethan and Claire are missing. Forced entry? No. Rachel slowly nodded. So everyone here knew each other. Crime scene photographers documented every inch of the farmhouse while forensic technicians began collecting fingerprints, shell casings, and biological evidence. Rachel remained focused on the dining room, where the confrontation had clearly begun. The table had been set for 3 people. Dinner plates still held untouched food. Wine glasses remained nearly full. Whatever happened had interrupted the meal before anyone truly began eating. Rachel followed the bloodstains across the wooden floor. Something immediately felt wrong. The largest blood pool surrounded Richard's body near the hallway, yet several smaller drops appeared inside the dining room several feet away. Their spacing suggested movement after the initial injury rather than a simple collapse. She crouched beside one stain. "This isn't consistent," she murmured. The lead forensic examiner joined her. "I noticed the same thing." Rachel pointed toward the hallway. "If Richard was shot there, why is blood already here? We're testing everything." Another investigator approached carrying evidence bags. No usable fingerprints on the handgun. Rachel looked up. None? Someone wiped it. That discovery complicated everything. If Ethan had killed Richard during an emotional confrontation, why clean fingerprints before fleeing? The careful detail suggested planning, yet every other sign pointed toward chaos. Witness interviews created even more confusion. One elderly neighbor insisted hearing angry shouting from inside the farmhouse before the gunshots. Another reported seeing only a single person leaving the property. A third believed 2 vehicles departed several minutes apart. None of their accounts matched perfectly. Rachel disliked contradictions. They usually meant important details remained hidden. Outside, investigators examined security cameras mounted around Richard's property. Most appeared functional, but the main system responsible for recording the driveway contained a damaged storage drive. The final hour of footage had vanished completely. "Accidental failure?" Rachel asked. The technician shook his head. "Doesn't look accidental. What does it look like?" Someone removed the files. Rachel silently absorbed the answer. Inside the farmhouse, another discovery emerged. A partially packed suitcase rested near the front entrance. Women's clothing filled the interior alongside toiletries, family photographs, and important documents. Rachel studied the contents carefully. Claire planned to leave. The observation shifted her thinking. Perhaps this dinner had not been intended as reconciliation. Perhaps someone expected it to become a final confrontation. Hours later, preliminary forensic analysis produced another unexpected result. Richard's hands contained defensive bruising consistent with a violent struggle. Ethan's blood was also identified on shattered glass recovered from the dining room floor. Yet another unidentified blood sample appeared near the staircase. It belonged to neither Richard nor Ethan. Rachel stared thoughtfully at the laboratory report. 3 blood sources, 1 dead victim, 2 missing witnesses. Nothing about the evidence supported a straightforward murder. Instead, every new finding suggested multiple people had struggled for control during the final moments inside the farmhouse. Somewhere beyond the police barricades, Ethan and Claire remained missing, carrying answers that the silent crime scene could no longer provide. By sunrise, Detective Rachel Bennett had abandoned the theory of a simple domestic homicide. The farmhouse contained too many contradictions, and every piece of evidence seemed connected to years of hidden dysfunction rather than one explosive evening. Richard Harper's death was becoming the final chapter of a story that had begun long before anyone heard gunshots. Rachel gathered her investigative team inside the command center. "We stopped looking at the shooting by itself," she said firmly. "Start looking at the family." The direction immediately changed everything. Digital forensic specialists recovered deleted messages from several mobile devices using advanced extraction software. Although Claire had erased her conversations months earlier, fragments remained inside encrypted backups. Hundreds of messages gradually resurfaced. Rachel read them carefully. Many appeared affectionate. Others carried unmistakable emotional pressure. Whenever Claire tried distancing herself, Richard responded with alarming statements. "You're all I have left. If you abandon me too, there's no reason to keep living. Everything falls apart without you." The messages rarely contained direct threats, yet each one tightened emotional pressure around Claire until leaving seemed almost impossible. Rachel quietly closed the file. "This wasn't only an affair," she murmured. "It became psychological control." Phone records revealed another pattern. Richard contacted Claire dozens of times during Ethan's workdays while barely communicating whenever Ethan remained home. Their conversations often lasted over an hour. Several ended moments before Ethan returned from construction sites, suggesting careful planning rather than spontaneous comfort. Financial investigators uncovered equally troubling discoveries. Richard had secretly paid several of Claire's personal expenses, including credit card balances and medical bills she had never discussed with Ethan. None of the transfers appeared large enough to attract attention individually, but together they created financial dependence hidden beneath acts of generosity. Rachel expanded the investigation beyond documents. Friends, neighbors, and extended relatives gradually painted a portrait of Richard that differed sharply from his public image. Everyone described him as charming. Few described him as kind. Ethan's childhood friend, Daniel Brooks, recalled countless moments when Richard quietly undermined his son's confidence. If Ethan succeeded, Daniel explained, Richard reminded him he could have done better. If Ethan failed, he reminded him nobody else would have tolerated the mistake. Rachel filled another page with notes. A retired schoolteacher described Richard attending nearly every important decision throughout Ethan's youth, speaking for him during scholarship interviews, discouraging relationships he disliked, and convincing Ethan that obedience demonstrated respect. What looked like guidance, the teacher admitted, often felt like control. Margaret Harper's younger sister offered perhaps the most painful revelation. "My sister loved Richard," she said softly, but near the end she confessed she barely recognized herself anymore. She always worried about upsetting him. Rachel left the interview convinced the family's tragedy had developed across decades rather than months. Meanwhile, officers continued searching for Ethan and Claire. Claire's bank accounts remained untouched. Her cell phone stayed switched off. Ethan's truck eventually appeared abandoned beside a remote hiking trail nearly 50 miles from Richard's farmhouse. The discovery intensified the search. Late the following afternoon, Rachel received an unexpected phone call. A local attorney spoke calmly. "My client wishes to surrender peacefully." "Who is your client?" "Ethan Harper." Rachel immediately organized the meeting. Hours later, Ethan entered the sheriff's office wearing the same clothes seen in surveillance footage after the shooting. His face looked exhausted beyond recognition, and fresh bandages covered cuts along one forearm. Rachel escorted him into an interview room. For the record, she began, "Where's Claire?" Ethan looked directly at her. "I don't know. Did you kill your father?" Long silence followed. Finally, Ethan answered, "I'll tell you everything." Rachel waited. "But Claire isn't responsible." He leaned forward, tears gathering in tired eyes. "Whatever you think happened. Whatever evidence you found." His voice nearly disappeared. "She isn't the monster." Rachel studied him carefully. Years investigating violent crime had taught her that guilty people often lied to protect themselves. Far fewer willingly accepted suspicion to protect someone else. As the recording continued, Ethan prepared to describe the terrible events inside Richard's farmhouse, unaware that the courtroom would soon decide whether his account revealed the truth or merely another carefully constructed version of it. Six months after Richard Harper's death, the county courthouse became the center of relentless public attention. Reporters gathered outside every morning, broadcasting updates about the family tragedy that had shocked the quiet countryside. What initially appeared to be a simple murder had evolved into a complicated case involving manipulation, betrayal, psychological abuse, and a deadly confrontation between father, son, and wife. Inside the courtroom, Ethan Harper sat beside his attorney, appearing thinner and older than he had during Detective Rachel Bennett's first interview. Claire occupied a separate witness room under protective supervision, waiting to testify. Neither had spoken publicly since the night Richard died. The prosecution opened by presenting the homicide as the inevitable conclusion of jealousy and humiliation. Mr. Harper discovered an affair, the prosecutor stated. He armed himself, confronted his father, and chose violence instead of lawful justice. The argument sounded straightforward. The evidence did not. Detective Rachel Bennett became one of the first major witnesses. Using photographs, forensic diagrams, and recovered digital records, she carefully reconstructed the final hours inside Richard's farmhouse. Jurors watched surveillance clips showing family members arriving peacefully before dinner. They reviewed deleted messages recovered from Claire's phone and listened to recordings demonstrating Richard's emotional manipulation over many months. Forensic specialists then explained the physical evidence. Richard's injuries indicated a violent struggle before the shooting rather than a planned execution. Bruises on Claire's wrists matched defensive gripping. Glass fragments containing Ethan's blood supported his statement that he had been injured while trying to separate Richard and Claire. The handgun revealed no usable fingerprints because it had been wiped during the chaotic aftermath, yet forensic timing suggested the cleaning occurred after emergency panic rather than before the confrontation. Next came Claire's testimony. The courtroom fell silent as she described months of emotional dependence, guilt, and manipulation following Margaret Harper's death. "I should have told Ethan everything," she admitted through tears. "I believed leaving would destroy Richard." The prosecutor stepped forward. "But you continued the relationship." "Yes. So you made choices." Claire lowered her head. "I did." Defense attorneys declined to portray her as entirely innocent. Instead, they argued that accepting responsibility for terrible decisions did not erase years of psychological coercion. Finally, Ethan entered the witness stand. His voice remained steady until describing the final moments inside Richard's dining room. When Claire said she would expose everything, Ethan explained, "My father lost control." He paused. He grabbed her. Jurors listened intently, pulled him away. According to Ethan, Richard struck him with enough force to send him crashing into a cabinet. The impact opened the drawer containing the handgun. During the struggle, Richard reached toward the weapon first. I reacted. His voice broke. I honestly believed he was going to kill her. Evidence supported portions of his account. Trajectory analysis demonstrated that the first discharge occurred while multiple people struggled over control of the handgun. Additional shots followed within seconds as the fight continued moving across the hallway. The prosecution acknowledged the struggle but insisted Ethan exceeded any reasonable act of self-defense once control shifted. This became revenge, the prosecutor argued. Years of humiliation ended with deadly force. Defense attorneys disagreed. They described decades of manipulation that had psychologically trapped every surviving member of the Harper family. This case cannot be understood through gunshots alone, lead counsel told jurors. Those bullets were fired during the collapse of a lifetime built upon control, fear, secrecy, and emotional abuse. Closing arguments divided both the courtroom and the community. Some believed Ethan should answer fully for taking a life regardless of circumstance. Others saw Richard's death as the tragic outcome of years spent manipulating those closest to him. When deliberations finally began, every person inside the courthouse understood that the verdict would decide far more than Ethan Harper's future. It would determine whether justice measured only the final violent seconds of a tragedy or the countless invisible wounds inflicted long before the trigger was ever pulled. The courtroom remained silent as the jury returned to deliver its decision. Every face reflected exhaustion rather than anticipation. Weeks of testimony had exposed painful truths, leaving no one untouched by the tragedy that had consumed the Harper family. Ethan stood beside his attorney with lowered eyes, while Claire sat quietly behind the defense table, unable to look toward him. The foreperson rose slowly. The jury found Ethan guilty of a reduced homicide offense after accepting that he acted under extreme emotional distress during a violent struggle. The court also recognized significant mitigating circumstances, including prolonged psychological manipulation and evidence supporting his belief that Claire faced immediate danger during the confrontation. The sentence reflected those findings. Ethan would spend years in prison, but far fewer than prosecutors had originally demanded. He accepted the judgment without protest. When deputies escorted him from the courtroom, Ethan turned toward Claire one final time. Neither spoke. They exchanged only a brief, heartbreaking glance that carried every apology words could no longer express. Then the courtroom doors closed between them forever. Claire walked outside alone. Freedom did not feel like victory. Newspapers continued publishing her photographs beside sensational headlines about betrayal, forbidden love, and murder. Former friends stopped answering her calls. Neighbors crossed streets rather than meeting her eyes. She eventually left the countryside and settled in another town under a quieter routine, volunteering at a community counseling center while attending therapy herself. Every morning she faced the same reflection, a woman whose terrible decisions had forever changed multiple lives. No amount of distance erased that truth. Detective Rachel Bennett completed her final report several weeks later. Closing the investigation should have brought satisfaction, yet the file remained heavier than most she had carried during her career. Richard Harper had died from gunfire, but the evidence convinced her that the homicide truly began years earlier. It began with control disguised as guidance. It continued through grief transformed into emotional dependence. It deepened with silence, secrecy, manipulation, and choices that nobody possessed the courage to confront before they became irreversible. Rachel closed the case file and placed it inside the department archives. Another investigation officially ended. Another family permanently disappeared. Months later, autumn winds swept across the abandoned Harper farmhouse. Weeds overtook the gravel driveway where Ethan had once returned home believing he owned a peaceful future. Broken fence posts leaned toward empty fields. Dust gathered behind cracked windows that reflected nothing except lonely skies. Inside, forgotten furniture remained exactly where investigators had left it after releasing the property. The dining room table stood quietly beneath faded family photographs, preserving the memory of a home that had once appeared warm and welcoming. Visitors passing along the country road rarely knew what had happened there. They simply noticed another neglected farmhouse slowly surrendering to time. Those who remembered the story spoke softly whenever the property came into view. They no longer discussed only the gunshots or the courtroom. Instead, they remembered how ordinary everything had seemed before hidden truths surfaced. Detective Bennett often recalled the Harper investigation whenever younger officers asked whether the most dangerous criminals always looked threatening. Her answer never changed. Sometimes evil entered a family quietly, wearing the face of trust instead of violence. Sometimes the deepest wounds were invisible until they destroyed everyone involved. And sometimes the darkest true crime stories were not born from strangers hiding in the shadows, but from secrets carefully protected inside homes that once looked perfectly ordinary.